Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday once again. Not too many left. Let me start by returning some quizzes from last class. And then we'll take a look at the homework that you have for today, which is still on the same page as the last homework assignment was. That is page 63 in your workbooks. So just one comment about the quizzes that I returned. Just be careful. We want to try to avoid having the soprano, the alto, or the tenor leaping back and forth like fourths and fifths and even more. I saw some really large leaps in the tenor and the alto going from one chord to the next. So try to find the nearest note in the next chord you need that fits the doubling, but also is pretty close to the note that you had in the chord before. So we can avoid these pretty large leaps of fifths and larger going from a chord to chord, especially in the inner voices. All right, so now let's, if you haven't already, open up to page 63. And today you had 3, 5, 7, 9, and 12, is that correct? Something like that? Okay. I'm thinking about, in the future, I'm thinking about not assigning number 5. And the reason I'm thinking about Xing that one out is because it's got a major 4 chord and a minor key. I don't know if you noticed that, but that's pretty bizarre. It's pretty bizarre. It doesn't change the part rating or anything, but it's just, I don't like it. It's a little warm. So, questions that you may have about any of these problems. I gave you the starting chord voicing for number 12, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Did you have a question?
Yeah, if we go over number 9.
Sure thing. Number 9 is in the key of B flat. And let me just make a little bit of space here for it. Let's see. I'll just put it easy here. And it's a key signature. I would probably, the way I started the first chord anyways, I voiced it like this. I have a B flat in the tenor, and I have an F in the alto. Because I do not want to have another D in a 1/6 chord. I don't want to double the bass. So then the next one is the 2/6. And if I can, try to double the bass. That's preferred in the 2/6. And I was able to do that by putting another E flat in the alto. So I do have the bass doubled here, and I've got all the chord tones, C, E, G. Yeah.
Could you flip those two by chance or not?
Let's see. So you put a G in the alto, and then you put an E flat in the tenor?
Yeah, and then for the I6, I put a B for the tenor, and then
Uh-huh. So did you leap from a B flat into either an E flat up here or down here?
yeah.
Yeah, that's probably a little too far of a leap. This arrangement, you have, it's smoother. You see how my tenor only has to leap a third? Yours probably has to leap either a fourth or a fifth, depending on whether you went up or down.
Could you double the C?
In this chord?
Yeah.
Yes, but Did you double it in the tenor?
Yes, I did. Or
Did
I
you
had,
start with a B flat?
I went from B flat to C, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's gonna create a lot because of B soprano. Yeah. So careful about that. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, so the way I did it, I might have gotten error, but I put, for the first chord, I put an F in the tenor and an F in the alto. Is that allowed?
Yep, that would be allowed too. Did you put your F like way down here or put it way up here?
I put it way over
You put it down
there.
here. Okay, and
And
then where did you
I
go?
moved it, up to a G.
Okay, let me think here. And you did the F down to there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that should be fine.
Okay.
That should be fine. At least I don't see any issues with that. Then the next chord is a 5 chord, and so we have F in the bass, and that's a root position standard chord, so I want to double the bass. So I had the tenor move down and share with the bass in that case. And I had my alto go down to a C to get that note, because I need F, A, C in the chord. And then last but not least, we have the final 1 chord, and I left the tenor right there on the F. I didn't have to move it. The alto I took up a step to the D, so I can get B flat, D, F with the B flat doubled. Yeah. Does that get at your question, Becca? So I guess the first chord you could have, it's an option, the tenor you could have started on the F or the B flat. That would be fine. Because I don't see any errors doing that. Good. Let's see what time we have. Other questions?
Can you just do 5?
Number 5?
Yeah.
I think I can. Okay, number 5 is in the key of B minor. And again, I tried to mention that major 4 chord is pretty strange. In the minor key, it's very rare. I mean, you can see it occurs because they've got law, or the raised scale degree 6 in the soprano, and that's why that occurs. But again, it shouldn't alter your part writing. So in the key of B minor, I've got a 1. Start with a minor 1 chord, and given this bass and soprano, I had the alto had a D, and I gave the tenors another B to double the root. That's how I got started. And then here's that strange major 4 chord, but so the bass has an E, the soprano has a G sharp. What I did is I took the alto up a step to an E, and I kept the tenor static on the B, so that I get the right doubling. And then the next chord, this is the one we learned about last class, 7 diminished 6. Okay. So we have A sharp in the soprano. And I do want to try to double the bass if I can. That's preferred doubling in this chord. So I took the tenor to a C sharp, and I was able to double it. And then I left the alto on the E, didn't have to move the alto. And then last but not least, I got a 1 chord, and I took the tenor up to a D, and I took the alto up to an F for smoothness. Because if I took the alto down to the D, then I would need to get an F in the tenor, and I'm coming from a C sharp, and I don't like that. That's just too far away. So that's how I do that one. Yes.
So,
Gotta make sure I copied it right. No, I didn't.
never mind.
You answered your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so just like last class, I'd like to give you another half-sheet quiz. And 2 out of the ones that I've assigned on page 63, could you just copy your inner voices for those 2? We'll take a few minutes to do that. now to page 63, and I'll go ahead and show you what I have. I've already shown you basically on the board what I have for numbers 5 and 9. So that means I just need to show you what I have for 3, 7, and 12. So 3. All right, number 3. Did you remember to put a natural under E in number 3? Yeah, we're in a minor key there. And we've got scale degree 7. The root of a 7 diminished 6 chord also needs to be raised with an accidental. And for this third chord here, I would accept either an F in the alto shared with the soprano or a middle C down in the alto. That would be fine, either or. And don't worry, the accidental is probably only 1 point if you didn't get the accidental.
I think I have the tenor and alto switched for most of it.
Okay.
Does that make parallel shifts or?
Well, I'm seeing that I've got a lot of parallel fourths with mine, so if you switch them, there'd be fifths, but the fact, did you put a natural under E?
I did not.
Because I was gonna say with an E natural and you flipped it, it'd be unequal fifths. But without the natural, I think you would have parallel fifths.
That's a problem.
Yes.
I don't want to compare, but I don't know why I wasn't paying attention to the half and the data filled in the notes as well.
Yeah, that's fine. Rhythm I'm not as concerned about. So like if you made your inner voices in the last measure quarter notes, that's okay. It's okay, I won't take it. Yeah. Good. Any other comments about this one before we go to the next one? Okay, let's try number, what's it, 7? 7 was not on the quiz, but this is what I have for number 7 in the key of E major. Again, notice that the inner voices, at least I found a way that my inner voices didn't have to jump at all, except the alto is leaping a small leap between the last 2 chords from E down to C, and that's it. C sharp.
Is it wrong if you have the alto and soprano doing parallel unisons?
Yes.
Darn it.
Yeah, parallel unisons, fifths and octaves are not allowed in this style. Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes the parallels will result because, well, I don't know, are you obeying, are you paying attention to the doubling guidelines we've been talking about for each chord? If you are, a lot of times you won't need to get parallel unisons or octaves. Sometimes I can see where that would still be possible. But you gotta get in the habit of, and that's one thing about when you start part writing, when you're first, kind of new at it, you gotta get in the habit of starting to look over your work. Do I see any pairs of voices that are moving in parallel motion? Then do I see any of those pairs of voices in parallel motion? Are they moving by unison, fifth, or octave? I know when I was an undergraduate, I had to check my work. I know sometimes checking your work is hard because you're so close to the situation, but at least take a look over once over and just double check to make sure you don't have those bad parallels, those kind of things. And to train myself to get in that habit. Finally, number 12. For number 12, there are a couple possible answers for the tenor in the second chord. For instance, my tenor, you could use either the high F right here, or you could use the D right there. Either one is fine. Did you remember to double the third in the sixth chord after the 5? We talked about that at the end of last class. So my final chord should have 1 A flat, 1 root, 2 C's, and 1 E flat. Because that's that deceptive progression. Okay. How we doing? You gonna survive? It's Friday? No? Okay. All right, then let's go on and learn the last set of doubling rules for the last first inversion chord that we need to discuss. The final first inversion chord we need to discuss is the 4 chord in first inversion. The 4 chord in first inversion. And I'm going to pull out that doubling sheet that I've given you, so I can just use that as a springboard for our quick discussion on this. There is a different doubling rule, unfortunately, but there is a different doubling rule for a major 4/6 chord versus a minor 4/6 chord. Okay? You might be pleased to know that there basically is no restriction on doubling for the major 4/6 chord. In fact, when you have a capital 4 in first inversion, you may feel free to double anything. You can double the root, you can double the third, you can double the fifth of the chord, you can double the bass, you can double another note in the chord. Whatever you want to double is fine. As long as that pitch fits into the chord, into the harmony, you are allowed to double that, as long as it doesn't create any parallel fifths, octaves, or unisons. Okay? So in this case, I've got, in the key of B flat major, I've got a 4/6 going to a 5. That is an E flat major triad going to an F major triad. And in this first measure, the fifth of the chord, or the B flat, is doubled of that E flat G B flat chord. In this measure, the root of the chord, the E flat, is doubled between the tenor and the altos. They're actually sharing one and the same pitch. And in this measure, the third of the chord, the G, is doubled between the bass and the alto. And all of these are correct because there are no part rating errors to going from the 4/6 to the 5. So the major 4/6 chord, out of all of the chords we have on this sheet for doubling, the major 4/6 chord is the most free, so to speak. And if I can play, let's see here, if I can play these examples for you. The first one. Doesn't have any problems. The second one. And finally the third one. Sorry guys, I just noticed I hadn't turned the TV on over here. So let me see if I can do that. Okay, there we go. Now we're in business. All right, so that's the major 4/6 chord. Now, the minor 4/6 chord has a different doubling rule because in minor keys, we have to be concerned about not writing in what's called a melodic augmented second. Okay, I'm going to freeze it right there. So, the doubling rule for a minor 4 chord in first inversion is as follows. Do not double the bass. Do not double the bass. Another way of saying that is do not double the third of that chord. The reason is because when you double the bass in a minor 4/6, you can get parallel octaves, as in the first example. You're bound to get a melodic augmented second in one of the voices, as in the middle example. But when you double something other than the bass, then it's much easier to stay free from part rating errors as you go from one chord to the next. I kind of did a little bit of, am I in the same? Yeah, I'm in the same key. I don't maybe have the same voicing, but in this first measure on the board, I'm in the key of A minor. And you see I have doubled the bass on purpose incorrectly. There's an F here and there's an F in the bass. And you see the error that I've created by doubling the bass. This interval that the altos have to sing from an F to a G sharp is an augmented second, and that is not permitted. That is not permitted in any voice. Okay? So that's one reason why, a big reason why you should not double the bass in a minor 4/6. Let's see here. What was another way that I had done? I had completed this. Let me look at my notes. Yeah, what if I did it this way? Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. This time, G sharp. Okay, so if I put the G sharp in another voice, then I don't have the augmented second with the alto anymore. But if I did it this way, and I still have the bass doubled in the 4/6 chord, now I have another error, which is just as bad. I have parallel octaves between the bass and the alto. Okay. So in order to eradicate these errors, in order to not even be able, hopefully, to commit these errors, what we want you to do is avoid doubling the bass in the 4/6 chord. And the way I did it is, if I double something else besides the bass, then I can get to this chord without any problems, without any errors that you saw before. And this would be a correct version, a correct way to write a minor 4/6 to a 5. Because I do not have the bass doubled in this example. I have another note of the chord doubled. Okay, so, in summary, for 4/6 chords, feel free to double anything you want in the major 4/6 chord, but in the minor 4/6 chord, you want to avoid doubling the bass. And again, that's the last thing on your doubling handout. And with that knowledge, with that information, we're basically completing our study of doubling and what we need to know to part right basically from any chord to any chord, triad to triad. We have not learned how to part right from 7th chords to other 7th chords. That will come next semester. But any triad to any triad, no matter what bass position the triad is in, I believe we should have a way to do that now. Okay, does anyone have any questions or concerns about that so far? Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through a whole part writing example that involves a 4/6 chord, because I want to talk to you about another non-chord tone for the rest of the class. But just remember this doubling rule for your homework, which is going to be a handout, and you'll have a couple of exercises on the top of the handout to part write that contain either a major 4/6 or a minor 4/6. So just be careful about that, and you should do just fine knowing the doubling rule and following the doubling rule for that. Okay, so today I want to talk to you about a third type of non-chord tone. A couple classes ago we talked about a passing tone. We talked about a neighbor tone. We learned that a passing tone is a non-chord tone. It doesn't belong or fit in the chord. That's approached by a step and left by a step in the same direction it's approached. Then a neighbor tone is a non-chord tone that's approached by step and left by step in the opposite direction from which it's approached. Okay? Well, this next non-chord tone that we're going to discuss is a lot more involved. There's a lot more to it, but even though it's more involved, I think it's much more satisfying, at least to the ear, than the other non-chord tones that we've talked about so far. Okay? First of all, I need to put up a quick example in this measure. I'll do it in the key of C major. And let's see, C here, G here, and yeah, let me put one more bar line in here too. How about G here, G here, and E here, D here, C here, and C, and B. Okay. All right, let's just look at these first two really thin, really skinny measures. There are no non-chord tones in the tonic chord in this measure. It's just all C, E, G, spelled as it's supposed to be. But in the second measure, the 5 chord, which in this key is supposed to be G, B, D only, you'll notice that this 5 chord has a tone that doesn't belong, doesn't fit. Which one of the tones in the 5 chord is not a G, B, or D, and where is it? Yeah.
The C.
Yeah, it's the C in the top voice. you see how this note, the C, doesn't fit into a GBD chord. So that makes it, therefore, by definition, a non-chord tone. But let's take a look, just in the soprano voice, let's take a look to see how this C, by the way, we have to put parentheses around it because it doesn't belong to the chord. Let's see how it's approached and left. Well, apparently, it looks like it's approached by the same note, and it's left by a step downward. It's approached by the same note and left by a step downward. And when you have a non-chord tone that's approached by the same pitch, or sometimes it's called a common tone, when it's approached by a common tone and left by a step down, that non-chord tone is referred to as a suspension. A suspension. Again, the definition of a suspension, you must always go back to the basic fundamental definition, is when a non-chord tone is approached by the same pitch and it's left by a step down. Okay, a step down. All right, now, what does a suspension basically do to the music? Well, a suspension kind of holds on to or suspends a chord tone from the prior chord. It suspends it after the other chord tones from this chord have moved on to different pitches to create another chord. Okay? So it suspends a chord tone after the other parts have moved on to the next chord. And so what it does is it kind of delays the arrival. It delays the arrival of the final chord tone that's needed to complete this harmony right here. Okay? You could say that, you know, it starts out as a chord tone, and all these notes fit in here, but 3 of the voices are going to move on to change the chord. While they do that, this one kind of is stubborn and persistent and kind of hangs on to, it's an outlier. While these chord voices are sounding chord tones, this one holds on to, and then finally relinquishes or gives up its note to fall to the note that does fit into the final chord. Okay? And to me, the sound of the suspension, this is my favorite non-chord tone of all. The sound of the suspension, I hope you like it. Starts out and sounds like this. Okay. That's kind of how that all works together. Okay. I will tell you, just for your information, suspensions always occur on an accented beat in a measure or an accented part of the beat. So you tell me, and let's say this measure is in, let's say we're in 2/4. In this second measure here, which beat is accented? Beat 1 or beat 2? We've talked about this a little bit, I think, last. Beat 1 is always stronger accented-wise, metric speaking-wise, than beat 2 is. So that's why the suspension falls on beat 1 rather than beat 2. A suspension will always fall on a strong beat in a measure or a strong part of the beat if you have like divisions of the beat or 2 notes per beat, anything like that. Now, to understand more fully how suspensions work, we need to investigate how they are prepared and resolved. And really, suspensions always occur in 3 stages. There are 3 steps or 3 stages that are always present whenever a suspension occurs in music. Okay? First of all, suspensions are approached or prepared by the same pitch. So, do you see this note here? How it's the same pitch as the suspension? That's part of its definition. Because the suspension is always approached by the same note or the same pitch, we call this prior pitch that it comes from, we call it the preparation tone, or the preparation note. And I'll number that as kind of step 1 in the whole suspension process. And the preparation note, 99.9% of the time, is a chord tone. In other words, the preparation note to the suspension fits in the chord in which it's found. Now, the suspension itself follows, and I have that marked with the parentheses here. Okay? it follows, and the suspension is dissonant with the new chord in which it finds itself, okay? And this is what I would number as basically step 2 of the whole suspension process. So what was a chord tone, other notes move, and now that same note becomes a non-chord tone, or it's dissonant. So that's why it's called a suspension. Okay? The suspension may or may not be tied to its preparation note. In other words, you see this a lot with suspensions, but you don't have to have a suspension tied to its preparation note. So that's optional. Ties are optional. Finally, the third step and the final step is the resolution. And this note right here is called the resolution tone, or the resolution note. And that's the third and final step of the suspension process. It's right here. The resolution note is a chord tone. The resolution note is a chord tone. It's always a note that fits into the chord that the other voices are already forming a part of. And the resolution note, following the suspension, always lies a second below the suspension, or a step below. Okay. So what we have in the grand total of the suspension process, surrounding this non-chord tone, we have what's called a preparation stage or a preparation note, which is a chord tone. Then we have the suspension stage, the same note, where it's not a chord tone, and then that moves down a second or a step always to a chord tone, and that's called a resolution. That's called the resolution of the suspension. Let me play that one more time. So we have. Now, there are 4 kinds of suspensions in the style of music we're studying. So you think, wow, suspension, that's a really neat type of non-chord tone. Well, there are 4 categories or 4 types of suspensions we can get in music. And the way we categorize or classify suspensions is that suspended notes are always identified by the intervals that the suspended note and the resolution notes create above the bass. Let me say that again, because that's really important. Okay, suspended notes are identified by the intervals or the interval sizes that the suspended note and the resolution notes create above the bass, the lowest sounding pitch of all. Okay? So we don't have to worry about interval qualities or anything like that, just the interval quantity or size of the suspended note and the resolution note. We don't have to worry about the preparation note anymore. You tell me, what is the interval that this suspended note C creates above the bass G? And just use simple intervals, don't use the really large compound intervals. G up to C is what interval size? A fourth, right? G up to C is a fourth. And then finally, what is the interval that the resolution note makes above the bass? G up to B in this case, a third. So what we do is we label this suspension specifically, and because the suspended note resolution notes above the bass create an interval of a fourth and a third, we call this particular type of suspension a 4-3 suspension. A 4-3 suspension. Now, as I said, there are 4 types of suspensions in music. These are the 4 types, and these are all interval numbers. One is called a 9/8 suspension. One is called a 7/6 suspension. One is called a 4-3 suspension, which I have an example of over there. And one is called the 2-3 suspension. And those are the only 4 types of suspensions we can get in this style of music. Any other type of suspension is not legal, it would be wrong, it would be incorrect, that kind of thing. Yes.
So when you're doing like the labeling like 4-3 or whatever, you don't care about like if it's G2 or G whatever. You just do it based off of the letter names. It doesn't matter.
Yes, yes. Yeah, you just use the base, just a simple interval. I mean, technically, this is probably at least an 11th, if not more, but we don't worry about that. Just based on the letter name, like you say, G up to C is the fourth, and G up to B, the resolution note, is the third, so it's got to be a 4-3 type of suspension.
How do you get like a 2-3?
Yeah, okay. All of these suspensions right here, you see how their first interval size is one larger than the second one? That happens when the suspension is in the soprano, the alto, or the tenor voice. In other words, an upper voice. This is the 2-3 suspension is the only one that occurs when the suspension is in the lowest voice, the bass voice. And sometimes this is called a bass suspension. I'm going to use this example in the next measure to try to show you here. I'm in the key of G. And this second chord in this measure is supposed to be D, F sharp, A, a 5-6 chord. Which one of these two notes in the bass does not belong in that chord? Which one's a non-chord tone?
The G.
The G, yeah. So I know it's kind of hard, but I have to put parentheses around that G. It's not part of the chord. Now, what type of non-chord tone is it? Is it, well, only three we know. Is it a passing tone, a neighbor tone, or a suspension? Well, how is it approached from left? Just look at the bass voice. It's approached by the same note, isn't it? And left by a step down. That makes it a suspension. Now I told you, to classify suspensions out to one of these four types, you find the interval that the suspended and resolution notes make above the bass. But here the suspension and the resolution notes are in the bass. We don't have any notes lower to compare them or calculate an interval with. So what we do when the suspension is in the bass, we look to a voice above, and we get the numbers for the type of suspension according to the voice with which the suspension is most dissonant. Let me see if I can say that again. When the suspended note is in the bass, you're always going to get a 2-3 suspension. The intervals for this type are calculated between the bass and the upper part with which the bass is most dissonant. Okay, so G to D, is that dissonant? No, that's a fifth. G to A, that's pretty dissonant, or there's another A here. What is the interval that the suspended voice in the bass makes with the tenor? A second, that's right. And what is the interval that the resolution note makes with the same other voice? An A, a third, right? So this must therefore then be what's called a 2-3 suspension. And you can abbreviate suspension SUS. That's totally fine. Is that not good?
There was a game and you used to call it like red sus, suspicious. The bass is sus.
Well, in this case, SUS always means suspension. But you see, only when the suspension is in the bass will you get a smaller interval before a larger interval. And this is why. Okay? And bass suspensions are always 2-3 suspensions. The other types of suspensions occur in upper voices will always be 9/8, 7/6, or 4/3. 4/3 suspensions. Okay? So let's take a look at just the rest of these measures here and see if we can analyze the rest of the non-chord tones. I've got all the notes, I've got all the part writing, I've got all the Roman numerals here. Let me tell you, there is, see if I can find it, there is a non-chord tone in this 4 chord here. The 4 chord in this key should be C, E, G only. Where's the non-chord tone? What is it?
The D.
The D. You see it? So put parentheses around it. How is the D approached and left in its own voice, in the soprano voice? It's approached by what?
A D.
Yeah, the same note, and it's left by a step
Below.
down. That's the recipe for suspension. So we know it's a suspension, SUS. Oh boy. I didn't have this problem years ago. Did this game come out recently?
Yes.
See, I didn't have this problem. All right, you tell me, which type of suspension is it? It's one of these 4. It's definitely not this one, right? Because the suspension's not in the bass. So it's got to be one of these 3. Let's calculate what the interval size is that the suspended note and its resolution note make always above the base, the lowest voice. D is how far above C? A second. Well, we don't have one of those with this.
We have a
Let's use the compound interval of a second in this case.
ninth,
A ninth. And how far is C above the base C?
an eighth.
An octave, yeah. So this happens to be a 9/8 suspension. Don't ask me why there's a little bit of inconsistency here. I don't know, sometimes they use compound intervals and most of the time they don't. But that's just the way it's come down to us. Okay? So, yeah, be careful. When your suspension is in an upper voice, don't think it's going to be a 2/3. If you get something that looks like a second, it's going to be a ninth, falling to an octave. Okay? All right, I think we've got two more suspensions to identify. There's an on-chord tone in this harmony. This should be just GBD only. Which pitch is not part of the chord? The C. Okay. Put parentheses around it. How is it approached and left? Got to make sure it's not a passing tone or a neighbor tone. It's approached by the same note and left by a step down. So it's got to be a suspension. Which type? One of these three. Check the interval size that it creates above the base. C above D is how far?
7,
Good. And then the resolution of B above that same base is for what? 6. See how easy this is? So that's a 7/6 suspension. And whenever you label suspensions, you not only have to put the SUS, but you have to give me the specific type of suspension.
I don't know if this will ever come up, but what is it when you have it approached by the same note, but then it goes up a step? Is that a thing?
That's called a retardation. We'll learn about that next
Okay.
week. Yeah. That's a different non-chord tone. But suspensions are always approached by the same note and then a step down. A step up is another one, completely different. Okay, last but not least, there's a non-chord tone in this one here. This is supposed to be D, F sharp, A only. What's the pitch that doesn't fit?
G.
The G, okay? Put parentheses around it. How is it approached and left? Let's look in the tenor voice only. It's approached by the same note, left by a step down. Which one of these suspensions is it going to be?
A fourth.
That's right, because G makes a fourth above a D and F sharp makes a third above. So I've got every kind of suspension in here. I wonder how that happened. 2/3, 9/8, 7/6, 4/3. Okay, before you go, can I go ahead and play this for you so you can hear what it sounds like?
sure.
Again, suspensions are my favorite. I wish we had more time to devote to them. In the key of G, it sounds like this. What do you think? You like that? I like that delayed sound stuff. It is all. That's what makes music really cool. And if you're in choirs, you get to sing those quite a bit. Okay, so I got to leave you with the last, the homework assignment for Monday is a worksheet. And all you got to do is complete this one side of this worksheet for Monday. And when you get this, you can go ahead and leave.
Did Marcus tell you what the label thing?
All right, have a great weekend, guys. See you on Monday. Okay, let me turn off the video.